Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast with your host, Andrew Langer.
Well, hey there. Welcome to another episode of the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. I am your host, Andrew Langer. Very excited to have our guest join us today. His name is Gordon Chang. He is an expert on China. He is a distinguished senior fellow with the Gatestone Institute and is author of a book called The Great U.S.-China Tech War. Gordon, before we get started, tell us a little bit about your background and how you got involved in these issues.
I was practicing law in Shanghai from 1996 to 2000. And when we arrived, I was extremely optimistic about the direction of the country. I can remember my wife, Lydia, getting on the phone and saying, "Mom, China's not communist anymore." And I agreed with her. I would have my clients, they would buzz into Shanghai, stay at the Grand Hyatt, which is one of the most spectacular hotels in the world. And they'd say, "China's not communist anymore." But as we lived there, worked there, traveled around the country, spoke to people, we realized it was a very different China than the one that I had first saw. And so that's why I wrote my first book, which is The Coming Collapse of China. Yeah. China didn't collapse when I thought it would, but we are seeing weaknesses today that have to concern everybody when we think about China's place in the world.
Right, because we talk about this and we know that China's got a massive population, and I used to quip, China essentially takes, the ideas of other Western societies, steals them and produces them with slave labor. But both of those are no longer really true. China is advancing in terms of science and in terms of its ingenuity, and at the same time, it's got a population that's in decline. This has got to be worrisome to the Chinese Communist Party, but it's also got to be worrisome to folks here at home. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, China right now, I think, has passed the peak. We see the continuing debt defaults, plunging property market, contracting economy, falling currency, worsening food shortages, deteriorating environment, and of course, these fast-moving COVID-19 outbreaks. But the most important and fundamental thing is what you mentioned. China faces the steepest demographic decline in history in the absence of war or disease. It's now about 1.41 billion, probably contracted last year, so it's a little bit smaller than that. But two Chinese demographers a couple of years ago said that that country would lose about half its population in 45 years.
Wow.
So we're talking about end of this century. China, could very well be under 500 million people. It's going to be very difficult for the party to navigate that. And it's certainly going to be very difficult for Xi Jinping because his form of diplomacy is trying to intimidate everybody. And you can't intimidate people if your country's falling apart.
But talk about this, because certainly I would think, and I could be wrong, 500 million people are easier to control than 1.4, 1.14, however many billions that they have there. But clearly you can do a great deal with AI, and I want to get a little into that. But I would think that the CCP would be thinking that 500 million people would be easier to control than the current population.
Yes, it would be, but to lose 2/3 of your population in 8 decades is really unprecedented.
Sure.
And it really means that, that they can't really maintain a society under those circumstances. We just haven't seen this before. So this is a lot of unknowns here. And it means a contracting economy, which means probably worse living standards for people.
Let me ask you this, because I want to talk a little bit later on about the Belt and Road policy and about the soft power abroad. But let's talk about what you first came out with, which is this idea of the Chinese government's no longer communist. And I would have agreed with you, right, that we could have called it state-sponsored capitalism, as I think how I termed it then. But obviously something changed, or did something change? Or did we miss it? And I guess before you answer that, because our friends on the small L libertarian side, they are the ones who say, well, the freest trade you have leads to freer societies. I question whether or not that is true anymore. Talk about those two concepts, about free trade and free societies, but also about whether or not we misdiagnosed what was going on with China's economy and political structure.
Well, certainly America misdiagnosed that, especially after the Cold War. And this could very well be the greatest mistake that the United States has made in its history. Because we had this notion, end of history, everyone becomes a liberal democracy.
Right.
We trade with China, they will become benign. But obviously that didn't happen. The regime became belligerent, more provocative, more aggressive. We did change the Chinese people. But right now, in terms of political outcomes, that might not mean too much.
Right. It gets down to what we've talked about in terms of the collapse of the Soviet Union. They want blue jeans, they want Pepsi, they want Pizza Hut. And so long as they want those things, they're going to embrace Western ideals. Not so much so, and certainly you can't apply what happened in because Chinese culture is very different than Russian culture. Yes, your average upper middle class Chinese citizen, they like having access to the latest technologies, et cetera. But in the end, they're also under very, very tight control in a way that we've never seen before.
That's right. The Communist Party runs the world's most sophisticated surveillance state. Yeah. It's got, depending on who you talk to, somewhere like between 520 to 610 million surveillance cameras. It's got the social credit system where everybody gets a constantly updated score. The Great Firewall, which is the most sophisticated set of internet controls, cutting off any country. You just go on. And of course, something we often forget, which is the neighborhood grannies. The winders, the old men and women who just watch every street and report to the Communist Party. And that's very effective.
It's funny. There was a story recently in the news about the Biden administration spending a few $100,000 on a project at the University of Washington on AI and monitoring speech. I want you to tie that in, and the alarm we should feel here when we see that, but tie that in and talk a little bit more about the social crediting system and how, just because we haven't as much time, as we have, we can get a little deep here. Talk a little bit about just what the social crediting system means. I think a lot of folks would be very interested in understanding just how that works.
Yeah. China is trying to put together a nationwide social credit system. There have been experiments around the country, and they're knitting them together. And what happens is everybody gets the same score to start out with, but that score is constantly updated based upon observed behaviors. So if you're caught on a street camera jaywalking, your score will go down. If you are criticizing Xi Jinping, your score will plunge. If you say what the regime wants you to say, your score goes up. And the reason why this makes a difference is because you can't get a mortgage, you can't buy a home, you can't send your kids to school, and if you get a low score. And matter of fact, Chinese officials talk about how not letting people even leave their homes if they get a low score. I don't think it's gone to that extent, but it has really crimped the lifestyles of people who are critics of the regime. And this is what they intend to do to make it nationwide and more effective.
When you say notified, are we talking there's an app that you have, or is it in your email account? Or how do you check your social credit score in
I don't know
China?
If you can check your score. The regime has it.
Okay.
And they are, what they're trying to do is, as I mentioned, is to take all of these little experiments and to perfect them into a nationwide system. I'm not sure they're entirely there yet. They had a goal of 2020 to put this in place, but it doesn't look like they've actually been able to do that because there's so many complications on all of this. Remember, you're taking all sorts of surveillance camera footage. You're taking test scores from schools. You're doing all sorts of things and trying to put it together in one comprehensive system.
Now, Gordon, I'm asking this, and I'm going to make the mistake of asking a question I don't know the answer to. In China, do they still have, we've been talking about, as we have the debate in America about cryptocurrency and digital currencies, there has been a lot of discussion about moving to a cashless system and a lot of debate over what that means in terms of economic freedom. do they still? I mean, do they still have cash in China, or are all transactions done electronically? How much of that gets monitored by the government? I would assume all of it.
That's a great question. China still has cash,
Okay.
but they've got two platforms. One is Alipay, run by Ant Group, which is affiliated with Jack Ma, and the other one is WeChat Pay from Tencent. And these are the world's most sophisticated, commercially available electronic platforms. Beijing is trying to compete with them with a central bank digital currency. The central bank digital currency is not really widely accepted, and people are resistant for a number of reasons.
Sure.
And you can imagine why, because the government knows all your transactions in real time. Also, they can take all your money away from you with the flip of a switch. So, that has not gone as well as Beijing has wanted it to. But China is farther along on the cashless goal than we are.
Yeah. No, and again, sort of tying all of these things together, the social crediting system, the AI, the ever more sophisticated level of technology in China, it's got to be pretty alarming. I mean, we've all seen videos now or pictures now of drones stopping people and making them hold up their phones to scan QR codes. Talk about that as part of this effort for control.
Yes, when they still had the zero COVID policy, which was ditched on December 7th of last year, Beijing went to extraordinary lengths to try to control people, to prevent any transmission of the disease at all. And what you're referring to is that in certain cities, they would actually have drones above streets, and they would be blasting all sorts of messages, but they also could be scanning and then requiring you to hold up your phone and show your QR code. And that was either red, green, or yellow. And that really, depending on the color, meant on what you could do. And the Chinese people actually got a little bit tired of this, and they complained about it. And they protested against it because Beijing used that system to prevent people from complaining and trying to get their money out of banks in a central Chinese city.
So let's shift gears and talk about the U.S. and China and the policies there. Let's start with China's I guess we'll call the soft policy, the economic foreign policy, and the Belt and Road policy. And you and I, when we chatted a couple of weeks ago, I threw out Halford Mackinder and his Heartland thesis. And you and I talked a little bit about Alfred Thayer Mahan, and we can also talk about Dave Seversky. Talk about all of these great geostrategic thinkers and how this plays into China's flexing of its soft power abroad.
Well, people have said, well, are the Chinese Mackinderites? In other words, do they believe in the heartland being the center of control? Or are they Mahanians, believing in sea lanes? And the answer is they're both.
Yeah.
They believe that they've got to control everything. So it's not just the Mackinder theories, but it's Mahan, it's Speakman, you name the geopolitical analyst, and they're in favor of, and that's their policy.
Well, let's talk about that now in terms of the Belt and Road policy and their efforts abroad and exercising control and dominion over other nations, including, by the way, the United States. And we're going to get into land purchases here because there are a couple of really crazy stories here. But let's talk about it elsewhere in places like Africa, South America, et cetera.
Yeah, the Belt and Road started out as two separate initiatives announced by Xi Jinping at the end of 2013. And these were initially wanted to tie the Chinese factories on the East Coast to Europe. But since then, they've been extended around the world. They've been extended into space. And perhaps most significantly, in 2017, they announced the Digital Silk Road, which was an attempt to tie the world's networks together to China. So Belt and Road has become no limit. The only place I guess they haven't talked about recently is Jupiter. But, apart from that, they do have their space and moon Belt and Road.
Talk about that because, it's funny. I just reread Andrew Chaikin's Man in the Moon. And Chaikin talks about this idea of we don't have a coherent policy, we don't have a goal. If we don't have a coherent goal in mind, we're never going to come together as a people to get there. China doesn't need to come together as a people, they just need to come together as a government. What are their goals in space? Are they going to be mining for H3 on the moon? Are they going to be using that to go elsewhere? Is China going to beat America to Mars?
Yes, well, China on the moon, to your first question, yes, they do want to mine helium-3. They want to mine everything else. Matter of fact, in 2017, the head of China's lunar program talked about how the moon and Mars should be considered sovereign Chinese territory.
Wow.
In other words, part of the People's Republic, provinces of China. And that's their goal. So it's not just economic exploitation. It's not just military. It's just conquest.
Why hasn't the United States woken up to that? Is it just that we're just tired of space? I mean, why do you think we haven't recognized that, if we don't wake up and do something, China's going to beat us there, and if they beat us there, it's not going to be like the Cold War. There's not going to be any adherence to any kind of international treaty on all of this. And frankly, I doubt that if the Russians had beaten us to the moon, they would have adhered to the international treaty. But set that aside for a moment. Talk about this.
Yeah, the answer is we're Americans, and we believe that we're entitled to be oblivious to what our enemies say.
Yes.
And this, just to give you an example, February 1993, terrorists detonate a bomb below the North Tower of the World Trade Center in New York City. Kill 6 Americans. We didn't pay attention. We didn't pay attention until 9/11 when Osama bin Laden reached out and killed 2,977 Americans in one day. That's when we took notice. It's the same thing with China. And that's really one of the weaknesses of not only American democracy, but democracies in general. You can go back to Tocqueville, and he talks about how democracies are very hard to rile.
Yeah. Yeah, which is probably, in some ways it's a good thing. In other ways, it's a very dangerous place to be. So, and with that in mind, generally, we've already really covered why U.S. has bungled the policy for so long. But let's talk about the most recent efforts. Both Taiwan, the U.S. disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan. Talk about the U.S. sort of late really seriously bungling our policy towards China.
Yeah, well, that starts, I think, in August of 2021 with the catastrophic withdrawal from Afghanistan. Yeah. That convinced Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping that they could do what they want. We saw the effects of that on February 24th of last year when Putin invades Ukraine. The Chinese are watching this very closely because they've got not only Taiwan in mind, but India, Japan, the Philippines, us. This is a one-way ticket downhill, at least for the present moment.
Yeah, it's interesting because I want to sort of noodle through this a little bit more and just what that means. China is going to continue to test us militarily, and they're going to see what our resolve is. Talk about what that means in real terms.
Well, in December of last year, a Chinese Navy fighter approached an unarmed U.S. Air Force reconnaissance plane in international airspace over the South China Sea, flew within either 20 feet or 10 feet, depending on who you believe. Yeah. But even at 20 feet, that was dangerously close. Also, on May 26th of last year, something even more provocative, a Chinese fighter flew right across an Australian P-8 reconnaissance plane, again in international airspace. Yeah. The Chinese did something never before observed in history, and that is they fired chaff, which is like aluminum foil meant to confuse radar, and flares in front of the P-8. And some of the chaff was actually ingested into one of the 2 engines of the Australian craft. That could have brought the plane down. Fortunately, it didn't.
So let's sort of talk about Chinese interference here at home, because there are a lot of different stories. And we can start with the political, right? We've already been down the road. We know, as we said, Russia interferes. Russia doesn't care who's in power so long as they are sewing up dissent here at home. The Chinese intelligence, Chinese military is also doing this. Talk about how they are interfering in our political processes as well.
Well, Radio Free Asia reports that in 2020, an intelligence unit of the People's Liberation Army actually based themselves in the now closed Houston Consulate. And from there, they used big data and artificial intelligence to identify Americans likely to participate in violent protests. And then the Chinese sent them videos on how to riot via TikTok,
Wow.
by the way. But we know that through TikTok, China has been glorifying drug use. It has been pushing critical race theory. This is just an attempt to take down the U.S.
You know, I used to joke that the Sony Walkman was Japan's revenge for America's getting Japan hooked on tobacco, that they were going to make all of us deaf. And that was a joke. I don't mean that seriously. But you're talking about really serious stuff, you know, whether or not it's manipulation of algorithms with TikTok. I want to talk, and let's tie that in with the other one of these other stories, which is the Confucius Institutes on college campuses, you know, which to me is reminiscent of the German-American friendship chapters on college campuses in the years preceding World War II. Talk about that.
Yeah, China, through basically the Communist Party's United Front Work Department, which is meant to work with other countries. They've established Confucius Institutes on college and university campuses. And at their height, there were about 115 or so of them. But they've also inserted Confucius classrooms, about 500 of them, into our secondary schools. This has been controversial. They've been rolled back. China's rebranding them. But obviously what they're trying to do is influence our, first of all, college students, but also discourse at the heart of higher education.
You know, it's interesting because I think the last time you and I talked, I mentioned I took a Chinese cooking class taught by famed Chinese chef Peter Chang, and also by some of the chefs at one of his restaurants, offered via the Confucius Institute on a local college campus of mine, without understanding this. And there was a young woman involved in the Confucius Institutes who became a darling of it. They invited her over to China. They did a whole exchange program. She got to tour around. And the whole idea became very clear, was to inculcate her into this idea that the Chinese are not a threat. That's really the goal in the end, is to, again, it's soft foreign policy. It's designed to confuse Americans and get them to throw up their hands. Am I understating this?
Yeah, that's absolutely right.
Yeah.
Xi Jinping has been pushing the notion that there's only one legitimate state in the world, and that is China.
Wow.
This is the imperial era notion that Chinese emperors believe that they had the mandate of heaven to rule what they call Tianxia, or all under heaven. But also, Andrew, it goes beyond that, because the theory is that heaven compels Chinese rulers to rule the entire world. So, that makes us nothing more than a colony.
It's interesting you say that, because again, we had the Chinese Communist Party, which for decades was doing whatever it could to excise any aspect of religion. We know this is part of the persecution of the Buddhists in Nepal, et cetera, Tibet. And yet, here we are. It's the same thing with the Russians and the Soviets. And now we see it, we know that there is a close relationship between Vladimir Putin and the Russian Orthodox Church. And now we have Xi Jinping, embracing these religious concepts. Is that part of what has changed over the last several decades? Is this hybrid of, it's not communism, it's not religious authoritarianism, it's a combination of a bunch of things.
Well, Xi Jinping has been ruthlessly moving against all faiths. It's not just the Muslim Uyghurs and Kazakhs in northwestern China, what China calls the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, and which the locals call East Turkestan, because they believe that they shouldn't be ruled by Beijing. But they've gone against the Christians, and really fascinating, they're going against the Buddhists. And Buddhism is thought, by the Chinese to be a local homegrown religion, although it did come from India. But the point is there is no faith that they are willing to accept these days, because they believe that all faiths are a competition to communism.
But there is nevertheless this mandate from heaven that the Chinese will rule everything under heaven's dominion, which is fascinating. Let's turn our attention to another really disturbing story. This issue of the Chinese government creating police stations in places like New York and in places in Canada. This is really disturbing to me.
Well, it is, and it's disturbing on two levels. First of all, it's disturbing the Chinese would even think to try to do this.
Right.
But what concerns me more, Andrew, is why they thought they could get away with it. And the answer to that question is, for decades, American presidents have known about the presence of Chinese Ministry of State Security agents who've been violating our sovereignty. We've known what their Chinese diplomats have been doing to intimidate and blackmail Americans, and yet a very little, and sometimes nothing, was done to it. So, of course, the Chinese think, well, why don't we open up a police station? We own this country. So really, the American people, of course, should be angry at China, but they should be even more angry at their own presidents.
Now, let me ask you this, because I want to make sure our viewers and listeners understand. So these were police stations. They were not posing as American police stations. They were out and out, or were they posing as American police stations, enforcing Chinese law, enforcing American law, enforcing whatever law? I mean, how would this manifest itself in, say, Chinatown in New York?
Yeah, in the one, people disagree whether there are one or two of those in the U.S., but the one that everyone agrees is on the Lower East Side. It's in Chinatown. It offers, they say, consular services. But it also is the home to Ministry of State Security agents who regularly contact, intimidate, blackmail Americans. And so really what this is, and this was opened without permission of the State Department. So this is not an American police station. This is just China establishing essentially what, the best thing you could say was this was a consulate.
Yeah.
But they had no right to do that.
Sure. Yeah, there are international precepts that need to be followed in all of this. So taking this into a different direction, we also have the problem of, Chinese-affiliated, Chinese government-adjacent entities buying not just farmland, but industrial agricultural companies in the United States as well. I think about Smithfield Foods, for instance, which I believe is now Chinese-owned. This creates huge problems from a national security perspective, and from a food security perspective, and from an economic security perspective. Talk about this.
Yeah, they did buy Smithfield, and we got to remember that when China needed pork, Smithfield exported it and didn't sell it into the local U.S. market. But there is so many more important things to worry about. So, for instance, in North Dakota, within 12 miles of Grand Forks Air Force Base, a Chinese food processing company bought 370 acres and plans to put in a corn milling plant. And from that plant, it would be very easy for Beijing to install passive listening devices, but also to disrupt signals that we control drones from Grand Forks.
Sure.
We have satellite uplinks there. Beijing could easily disrupt those signals. So it's not just espionage, it's also sabotage. And we're allowing this in our own country. So this is on us.
It's interesting because I've had conversations with folks about the Jones Act. For those of you who don't know, the Jones Act is a long-standing rule of maritime law that all ships that go within the United States, between ports within the United States, have to be U.S. built and U.S. flagged. And again, our friends in the small L libertarian and the true free market limited government, they're like, well, it's no problem. It's great to have ships that are built in China. It's great to have ships that are built in South Korea. And really, we should allow these ships to just pass wherever they want within the United States because they're not under threat. I'm sure you would agree with me. There is a threat to Chinese flagged merchant vessels sailing up and down the Mississippi or other waters where they can spy on. They talk about this.
Yeah, I mean, this is a great debate among economists who say, well, if another country wants to subsidize American consumers, go ahead and let them. But what has happened is that through predatory practices that violate, for instance, China's World Trade Organization obligations, they put Americans out of work. When they put Americans out of work, there's a sense of hopelessness. And that's why one of the reasons why we have a fentanyl crisis, a drug crisis in the United States, is because people don't have jobs. And people don't have jobs because China didn't want them to have jobs and is now backing the fentanyl gang. So essentially, you've got Communist Party is selling fentanyl to Americans.
No.
And here again, Andrew, if I can just say, this is a question of Chinese criminality, but it's also a question of American presidents knowing what's going on and not taking the steps to stop this. We can stop this. This is our country.
How afraid are we as a nation, or how afraid are the people who are in power from taking action on this because of how much U.S. debt the Chinese government owns or Chinese, corporate interests own? I know they're one and the same thing, but for the sake of argument, let's say that they're different.
Well, in fact, American leaders are afraid of it, but they shouldn't be, because let me just explain something which puts this into context. And that is, if China wants to sell our debt to hurt us, they get back dollars, because 100% of our debt is denominated in our own currency, which means if the Chinese want to hurt us, they've got to put that into other currencies. Other currencies that's going to drive those currencies through the ceiling. Central banks in those other countries are going to have to buy dollars in order to bring their currencies back down into some sort of equilibrium, which means that, this is not going to hurt us. This is going to hurt China, because it's in China's advantage to be able to hold dollars.
Yeah. So what's the end game here? I mean, as China's population shrinks, as they grapple with these concerns, what ought the United States be doing in order to help China transition into a stable, prosperous, and freer society?
It would be nice if we could do that, and we've been trying to do that for decades, but it doesn't work. And right now, we've got to protect ourselves, which means cutting trade, cutting investment, cutting technical cooperation, because as much as we would like to help the Chinese people, their regime has declared the United States to be its enemy. In May 2019, People's Daily, the most authoritative publication in China, declared a quote-unquote people's war on America.
Wow.
And of course, because we're Americans, because we're oblivious, we didn't pay attention.
And we need to. Again, this is no different than people in some of the Middle Eastern nations calling America the Great Satan. We've obviously sat up and paid attention there. I mean, is it because we've just become so complacent to it, or because we haven't had a direct sort of flare-up militarily? At least we had terrorist attacks for so long. We've had the situation with the Russians for so long. Is it that when Nixon went to China, it reset America's perception of China? We've sort of been asleep at the wheel?
Well, during the Cold War, we certainly needed China's help against the Soviet Union.
Sure.
But after the Cold War, we haven't. And we have not been paying attention to what the Chinese said. We believed in the end of history, Francis Fukuyama's famous theory that every country would evolve into a liberal democracy with a free market. That's a nice theory, but the problem is it hasn't worked out so far. And what we have done is we have strengthened a hostile regime.
I have a colleague who is very Eeyorish about this, very cynical about this, and he says that liberal democracy has been the exception and not the rule, and that eventually we have these things happen. Let me ask you this: I ask all of my guests this: when you're not dealing with policy issues, when you're not examining and closely keeping tabs, you're always closely keeping tabs on what China's doing, but what are some of your outside interests? What are you doing when you're not doing this work, Gordon?
Sleeping.
Good. That's good. I appreciate that. Well, Gordon Chang, thank you very much for joining us. He is Gordon Chang. He is the Distinguished Senior Fellow at the Gatestone Institute. He's author of The Great U.S.-China Tech War. Thank you so very much for joining us today, good sir.
Thank you, Andrew.
And this has been The Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. I'm your host, Andrew Langer. Enjoy the rest of your lunch.
This has been the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour podcast, hosted by Andrew Langer. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.